Welcome back to Baltimore Beatdown. I'm your host, Nikhil Mehta. With me, as always, is Daniel Rotter. And of course, all of the big deals in Major League Baseball went down basically in the following 3 to 4 days after we recorded our last episode. So we talked a lot about what we want the Orioles to do in free agency, and some of those dominoes have already started to drop. The biggest, of course, being Juan Soto, who was never really in play for the Orioles, but it is certainly a good thing for the team that he is no longer in the division with the Yankees. Daniel, what are your maybe initial thoughts on Soto signing with the Mets and then moving on to the Orioles? Did you like what they did in the first stage of free agency?
Well, thanks, Nikhil. It's good to be back here on another episode of Birdwatchers, and certainly ecstatic to see, like you said, Juan Soto is leaving the AL East. He's heading over to the National League again, and I mean, there were certainly, a lot of reactions to this Juan Soto historic signing. He got 765 million over 15 years. Unlike a lot of these Dodgers deals, none of the money was deferred. So Steve Cohen really just kind of put it all on the table to try and become the face of New York, being the Mets and no longer the Yankees. But look, Juan Soto is on a Hall of Fame track right now. He is easily on his way towards making it in on the first ballot. I mean, I know he might be trending towards being a DH in the second half of his career, which means he's really going to have to hit. But so far, that's exactly what he's done. I mean, look, the biggest thing about Juan Soto, I think, is that he is so good at being selective. Like his walk rates are unreal for a guy who can also hit the ball that hard. Like he never strays from his approach. He is always giving, I would say that the term professional at bat might most apply to Juan Soto of any player in the MLB because he is always giving you the most professional at bat. He does not go out of his zone and he hammers pitches in the zone. Like that is exactly what a professional at bat is. And that is what the Mets forked over the largest sum of money in professional sports for. I mean, I know that he's not dynamic on the base paths or pitches like Ohtani, but look, you want guaranteed, as close to guaranteed production from a hitter as there is. That's Juan Soto. And so I don't think that you can put a price tag on that in today's MLB. The price tag is whatever Steve Cohen's willing to pay for it. And yeah, it might end up looking bad at the end of his career, but they did this deal for the first 5 years for sure.
Yeah, I think really, really good point about the idea of a professional at bat. There are a number of times during last season, the last couple of seasons, where you'd see Juan Soto's name mentioned in the same sentence as Barry Bonds in terms of some at bat streak without swing, some kind of statistic where he's mentioned the same sentence as Barry Bond, which is pretty good yardstick in the first place. But I think it's very interesting. His approach is different than Bonds. And the reason he gets walked is very different than Bonds. The reason Bonds got walked is, yes, very good eye, very selective at the plate, but a lot of it was just that pitchers were just so afraid. Soto is just his approach is I'm only swinging at what's in the zone. I have like his eyesight is incredible. His ability to pick up spin on the ball and figure out where the ball is going to finish. And that is like it's less that pitchers are afraid and more that if they're an inch off, he's not going to swing. And I think it's that kind of really impressive discipline. All of the kind of background stuff about the Yankees and the Mets is, I think, more internet fodder than it is for anything else. Although I will say, like you said, Cohen's sending a huge message with this signing to any other player that's going to hit free agency in the next couple of years. That is, if you are worth the money, we will be the ones to give it to you. So that and the kind of organizational culture that he's building. I mean, the turnaround of that Mets team over the second half of the season was really impressive. So yeah, and good for Juan Soto, man. That's the largest contract in professional sports history, even more than like some of the crazy soccer contracts that get handed out. So that's wild. The Orioles, like I said, we're not never really in on the Juan Soto sweepstakes. But they made their first couple moves over the weekend, signing Tyler O'Neill to a 3-year, $49.5 million contract with an opt-out after the first year, and a 1-year deal with Gary Sanchez worth $8.5 million. Two, I think, reasonable contract prices for both players. Both of those are positions that we talked about in our last episode, a right-handed bat corner outfielder and a backup catcher for Adley Rutschman. Let's start with O'Neill, Daniel. What do you think of O'Neill as a player? And then we can talk a little bit more about the value of the contract.
Sure, O'Neill is obviously a talented player. He's now had multiple seasons of more than 30 home runs in the past 4 years. But you can't go far into talking about O'Neill without talking about that injuries have been a huge problem for him. He's missed a lot of time, even in the seasons where he hit 30 home runs, he missed time. And even though he's in tremendous physical shape, I mean, you look at the guy, he's freaking jacked to the gills, but it's important to consider that we may not get a full 162 out of him. But if we do, I mean, there's certainly 40 home run potential there. I can't help but think that this feels like a little bit of bargain bin shopping, that we could have brought back Santander if we had wanted to, but we thought he might not be worth the 5 years that it's reported he wants. So it seems like we did kind of pivot early on a cheaper alternative that we thought might produce similar value. And it is something that we needed for sure, because I mean, losing Santander, you're losing a right-handed option against lefties. And then we did try and bring in other righties at the trade deadline to kind of fortify our lineup against lefties. We tried Eloy Jimenez. It didn't really work out. We brought in Austin Slater kind of for depth, and he did all right against lefties. He proved to be, playable at least. So I think bringing in O'Neill, what was really we wanted to know that we were going to get a right-handed hitting outfielder, but we didn't really know that we wanted to commit all that money to bringing back Santander. So I think, look, he's going to be hitting in the middle of the lineup, and he's going to be expected to hit 30 home runs if he stays healthy. So he's not a bad player, but it does feel like, still a little bit of the good old penny pinching Orioles in a way.
Yeah, I think O'Neill, one thing is he seems like a lot younger than Santander. That's only because he's come kind of into our consciousness more recently. Santander's been around the Orioles for so long. O'Neill has really only took off in 2021. But he's still 29. So, in a way he's a vet, but he also doesn't have that much long-term upside. A lot of people have kind of compared him to Santander, discount Santander. I agree with the discount part, but his splits are actually a little more extreme in terms of, a lot of the advanced metrics where he's in the single digits of, whiff rate, K rate, whereas Santander, was in the 77th percentile of whiff rate, 66th percentile of K rate. So I think he is maybe somehow even more of a boomer bust guy than Santander. But I think that Mike Elias's recent comments about Heston Kjerstad, at the winter meetings, about expecting Kjerstad to have a pretty big role in the team this year, which is something that you touched on during our last podcast, really tells us, between Kjerstad and O'Neill, you have most days one's going to play right field and the other can DH. Maybe Kjerstad sits against lefties. Based on the comments of O'Neill's agent, if I remember correctly from winter meetings, it seems like he's expecting to play almost every day too. Like you said, the injuries, will be a factor to that. But it's an interesting signing. Again, an even more of a boomer bust guy, a guy where some of the advanced metrics say yes and some say no, and so really makes you wonder what the Orioles' internal metrics are telling them and how they're projecting him, and maybe what they see in his game that they can improve on when he's in Baltimore. And then 3 years for 3 years for $49.5 million. Both the annual amount and the length, this certainly seems to me will be cheaper than what Santander can ultimately get. So I also agree with what you said earlier, which is they found a less expensive option. Now, to me, that's fine as long as they're going to use the money that they're saving elsewhere. And that is the big and lasting concern about this front office. That is, their pursuit of value makes them miss out on, the kind of serious upgrades that they need to be an annual World Series contender. So what did you think about, the value of the deal? Is it what if you're the general manager and that is what it takes to get the deal done, do you still make that deal?
Ultimately, I think the value was fine, and I really think that if O'Neill does end up staying healthy and has a good year, he's going to walk, and that's why he wanted this opt out in. He wanted the 3 year security to say, hey, if I get injured this year, I am able to fall back on this nice cushy 3 year deal. But I mean, if I hit a bunch of home runs, I want to be able to hit the open market again and capitalize on my value even more. So it does seem like a deal that was kind of tailored to a talented yet injury prone player. And looking at his approach, like you said, I mean, he wants to hit the ball hard every time he's up there. It looks like he swings hard. His exit velos and his hard hit rates are phenomenal, but he strikes out a lot. So I think he's going up there. He's trying to hit home runs because he's a physically imposing player and he knows that he can. So I think that it's just something we're going to have to work through. There's going to be strikeouts, but there's also going to be some really fun moments. And I know you referenced his agent saying that he was going to be an everyday player and that him and Kerstad might kind of platoon a little or share the DH spot. I also think that this move kind of indicates this move and us moving the wall in indicates to me that Cedric Mullins might not be penciled in or written in the lineup in pen every day, just because of how much Cowser has emerged as a strong defender. He could play center. We're now moving in the wall in left field, which means we don't necessarily need a second center fielder in the outfield either. And considering Mullins was not very good offensively last year, I think that between the three of them, there's going to be somewhat of a rotation. And I think the pecking order is kind of Cowser 1, O'Neill 2, and then Mullins and Kerstad maybe only play like 3 or 4 times a week each. And I think that you kind of will pick your battles where you want a stronger defender versus a more impactful hitter between the two of them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I think the recency bias of Mullins' last month or so, um, and was one of the few players that felt like to hit in the playoffs at all. It makes me think that I think he'll come in to this season with, a similar ability to compete for a starting role, but agreed, talent-wise, I think it'll be tough for him to beat out O'Neill and certainly O'Neill and even potentially Kerstad to play every day, especially, the Orioles. You talked about this, and I thought you put it really eloquently last game. The Orioles really, like, they didn't waste a pick on this guy. They really do see him projecting as a top player, and there's a reason that they held on to him at the trade deadline when they could have moved him for more than what they were able to ultimately get. So agreed. I think, like you said, I think O'Neill is still going to hit some nukes. I think that's just going to be fun. That is, always enjoyable. It's going to be disappointing not to see Tony Taters hit balls from, the top of his shoelaces and above his head. But O'Neill seems to have a similar lack of plate display. Although his walk rate is actually pretty high. His walk rate's actually pretty good. So uh, I think like you said, the value's okay. It's a bat you need in the lineup based on what was available in the free agency market. I think it's a solid signing, but again, that comes with the caveat that the money that you're saving, the prospects that you're saving by not trading for a bat means that you need to go invest in pitching. One more batter to talk about before we talk a little bit more about pitching. Gary Sanchez, 1 year, $8.5 million deal. I forget how much James McCann's deal was for when he was here. I'm going to go check that real quick. But what's your initial reaction to the Gary Sanchez signing?
I was a little surprised, especially because the news broke so shortly after the O'Neill signing that we were clearly making some moves that evening. I really thought that we would bring in more of a defensive first minded backup catcher, honestly. Because we saw this past year that Adley just didn't really seem to hold up that well over the course of the entire season, which that's in no way trying to talk down on Adley as a catcher, because look, playing catcher for a whole major league season does sound like horribly taxing on your body. But I kind of figured that, since we saw kind of a veteran pitcher like Burns shift away from wanting to throw to him and throw to more of a veteran, I thought that we might be going for more of that defensive minded bridge to Basayo. But instead, we decided to go with somebody who has a chance to be a better offensive weapon than James McCann, which is interesting in its own way. I mean, look, Gary Sanchez is not the same player that he was when he came up with the Yankees. He's not really a super impactful player, but I think you can count on him to give you, a fair amount of home runs for the at-bats that he's getting. And he's not going to hit for a great batting average, but not a lot of backup catchers do. So to get him on a 1 year deal, like I said initially, he is kind of the bridge to Basayo. And I think that if Sam Basayo has a strong year in AAA, we'll be inclined to bring him up at the end of the season. And that might be when we designate Gary Sanchez for assignment. So I think he's really going to be getting us through the first half. Um, and just kind of taking those 2 to 3 starts at catcher a week where we can let Adley DH and hopefully produce a little bit better as a hitter, and hope that by giving him 2 to 3 starts a week, we're putting in a major league hitter instead of a catcher who we have to make hit.
Yeah, I think that to me the Adley is such a solid defensive catcher that if that's a guy you're starting at catcher most days, I'm more of a proponent that your backup should actually be a bat, because that way he's, I don't think Sanchez is really going to be used as a DH, but that way you don't have a complete hole in your lineup when you do have Adley out or you do want Adley to DH more often. Especially if the goal is for Adley to DH more often, then the catcher that you have actually does need to be a bat, instead of just a purely defense guy. In terms of value, it seemed, I guess, a little bit steep for me. I get obviously the Orioles can afford it. McCann was on a $10 million a year contract, but the Orioles only paid him $5 million of that across 2023 and 24, with the Mets eating most of his salary in the trade. And Sanchez obviously costing significantly more than that. He should hit a good bit better than McCann. But McCann also had some intangibles, some leadership qualities that were clearly evident in the clubhouse, certainly defensively in his ability to manage the staff. Being Burns' personal catcher, kind of shows you how much respect he has with pitchers. So not saying that I would have wanted to bring McCann back. And again, looking at what was out there, Sanchez was probably the best option, but felt a little bit steep for a backup catcher. And again, it just makes me concerned that the front office can be like, well, we overspent on a backup catcher, so we can't, go out and spend a bunch of money elsewhere. It's kind of something that they have to prove to the fan base, that they are, as committed to this, if money as, everyone is with their words. And O'Neill's a solid signing. Sanchez shows a willingness to pay money, but pitching is really going to be what this comes down to. Before we move on to the rest of the division, because I do want to talk about some of those big moves that do affect the Orioles this year. Based on the signings that have already happened this season, Daniel, are there any out there that you're seeing, you're like, I wish the Orioles would have done that? If you were Mike Elias and you knew that's the number that it took to get a deal done, are there any that you look at and said, I would have pulled the trigger on that?
I think that the Eovaldi contract was a fair value. The Nathan Eovaldi contract, where he went back to the Rangers at 3 years, 75 million, was a fair valuation for his services. Look, he's not a frontline starter. He's in his mid-30s. I think that's something that we could have done, but I think it's also possible that he enjoyed his time in Texas and he did want to go back. And that if we had offered him the same deal, or even maybe a little more, he just chooses to go back to the Rangers. So maybe, a guy at that stage of his career would almost just prefer like the security of being with the team he just won a World Series with and that sort of thing. But I think even, kind of going somewhere in that 3 year, maybe a little less than 30 million AAV would have been acceptable for Eovaldi, especially looking at some of the other contracts that went down, because to be honest, not a lot of them seem like contracts I would have wanted to do. I mean, Luis Severino got 3 years at 60 something million, which feels like a lot for a guy who, had some great years initially in his career, but has been banged up and, hasn't necessarily been a sure thing, even though he was good last year. I mean, Kikuchi went for 3 years. And while he's a solid pitcher, I mean, that's something that I think also we maybe could have done is bringing in Yusei Kikuchi. I know he's not an ace, but he did have some good results last year with the Astros. Clearly, the Angels were all over him because they locked up that signing very early. There's still a lot of, names out there, guys who could be middle of the rotation starters, but the one more frontline starter who went, and I know we're going to wait to talk about this for a little bit, but the one frontline starter who went, I thought that was a bit much.
No, I think that's a perfect transition. I assume you're talking about Max Fried to the Yankees.
Yeah.
That was correct me, 8 years, 218 million. Do I have that
Yeah,
right?
he wanted to be the highest grossing left-handed pitcher of all time. He wanted to beat David Price's contract of 217.
Interesting. And so the Yankees are in that position. I I talked about this last episode too. After missing out on Soto, the media market and the fan base there means that they had to, according to the laws of the Steinbrenners, go out and get one of the top remaining arms. And then when a guy gives you such a clear goal like that and a number, you're like, okay, that's if our negotiations are giving you 218, done. And that, I agree that it's an overpay. I'm not surprised that it was an overpay by the Yankees after missing out on Soto. You would kind of hope that that maybe takes them out of the Burns sweepstakes. It does seem like there's something going on with Bora's clients in the Yankees, where there's some kind of disconnect there based on his comments, Soto's comments. And so, if they're completely out of the Burns sweepstakes, and they overpaid for free, then I'm very happy about that. Also pull off a big trade for reliever Devin Williams from the Brewers. I'm trying to pull up the terms of the trade right here. Gave up Nestor Cortez, going back to the Brewers along with infielder prospect Caleb Durbin. Brings one of the best relievers in Major League Baseball into the Yankees bullpen. Um, Now that's a deal that I would be more interested in pulling off. I don't think the Orioles really have a Nestor Cortez type player that the Brewers would be interested in, which I think is the big obstacle, would be the big obstacle to that trade. But I think going and getting one of the best relievers in the game would have definitely been a good move if you're not going to go out and spend the actual money on a free agent starting pitcher.
I like the value that the Yankees got on that trade. I know there's been some back and forth about, oh, well, the Brewers have been a great pitching lab and they might, kind of unlock Nestor a bit more, which is fair to say. I mean, they turned, Colin Ray and Tobias Myers into solid starters this season to get them through the season. But in actuality, I really don't think Nestor is very good. And he's also a free agent at the end of 25. So this was basically, good rental reliever, really good rental reliever for middle of the rotation starter rental, and we'll kick in a contact first, second base prospect, and maybe you guys are able to get him to be a regular for you guys, and if not, then you're getting a starting pitcher that you can insert into your rotation right away. I like the value for the Yankees. I do think this is something the Orioles could have pursued if they wanted to. Williams is one of the nastiest relievers in baseball, to be quite frank. So I wasn't too pleased as an Orioles fan to see that went down. And they're certainly trying to go all in on run prevention since they weren't able to get their main target in run creation, and bringing in Fried, who I think that was an overpay. Honestly, I don't think Max Fried is going to be an ace-like pitcher for much longer, just because I don't think his stuff is necessarily that great. But Williams, for 1 year, you put him with Luke Weaver, who was excellent as their closer down the stretch. It's an imposing eighth, ninth inning combo.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, like you said, run prevention over run creation. When you look at the market, yes, they could go out and sign a Santander, but he's not having the impact that Soto has in your lineup. Not just statistically, but the actual strategic impact that Soto has in the lineup is so huge, and not something that Santander or anyone else on the free agency market can recreate. I think in terms of Cortez too, I also think that you could argue that the Yankees already kind of reinvented him and figured out how to get the best out of him, and it's unclear if you can do that many times in a pitcher's career. The other big move in the division in the AL East was the Red Sox trading for one of the biggest players on Orioles fans' wish list over the last couple of years, Garrett Crochet. Gave up Kyle Teal, their 25th overall prospect, as well as Braden Montgomery, Chase Midroith, and Wickelman Gonzalez. Have not heard of any of the last three. Kyle Teal is the number 25 overall prospect, not the Red Sox number 25 overall, to be clear. So a decent return for the White Sox once it became clear that they were just not going to sign Crochet to a long-term deal. Obviously, one of the better pitchers in baseball now comes in the Orioles division instead of coming to Baltimore itself. Um, Certainly, to me, a deal the Orioles could have pulled off if they wanted to get aggressive and land Crochet. But I think when they didn't do it at the trade deadline last year, I think it became pretty clear that their valuation of him was not going to meet the White Sox's.
Yeah, I certainly have some thoughts on this trade. First and foremost being Garrett Crochet is inherently a little bit risky. He really is, his ceiling is up there with any pitcher in the game. I mean, he was so dominant, and the underlying metrics tell you even more than like his ERA. I mean, his K minus BB at like 29.5% last year, strikeout minus walk rate is nuts. I think his xFIP was more than a whole run lower than his ERA. Like he was special last year, and he is a true frontline starter. But going into 2024, I think he had only thrown something like 22 innings over the past 2 or 3 seasons before that due to injury. So the White Sox really had to load manage him down the stretch. I mean, in August and September, he was only pitching like 3 or 4 innings max each start just to keep him going through the rest of the season, preserve his trade value, it seems like ultimately. So look, there's going to be concerns about his health and his innings. And are you going to be able to just scale him up to 200 innings if he's pitching great? Maybe not, because, you don't want to risk injury for a guy who has amazing frontline stuff and who already has a history of injury. The Red Sox have one of the most talented farms in the MLB right now, at least going into this trade, especially offensively. By trading Teal and Montgomery, I believe those were their last 2 first-round picks in each of the last 2 drafts. They were both top 10 picks. So both of them are a pretty big deal. Montgomery was most recently the number 8 pick in this past year's draft. And a lot of people like his ceiling. He's a switch hitting outfielder who has great exit velos. And if they get him to lift the ball more, certainly could be an impactful power hitter, as well as just being a good athlete. Chase Meadroth, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I know Red Sox fans kind of had been comparing him a little bit to Dustin Pedroia because he's an undersized, good contact hitting righty second baseman. I think defensively feels a little bit unclear as to what exactly, the home for him is. Is he athletic enough to handle second base, for over the course of an entire career? Is he maybe more of like a first base option, but then you really have to hit to play first base? I think the White Sox would probably try him at second to start. I think that this kind of archetype almost reminds me a little bit of Kevin Millar, and I don't know exactly how like their physical makeup stacks up, but like tried him at second base early in his career. Turned out he wasn't really quite athletic enough to hold up there defensively his whole career, so became more of a first baseman. That would be ultimately a good outcome for Meadroth if he ended up having a Kevin Millar type career. But I mean, look, this is the trade that the Orioles should have made if the valuation was right. There is nobody available who has a ceiling like Garrett Crochet. I wonder what it would have taken. I don't know if I'm able to part with Mayo in a Crochet trade, just because I don't think the Red Sox had to part with anyone like Mayo, because they have better hitters than Teal and Montgomery in their system. Roman Anthony, I think, is a pretty consensus top 10 overall prospect. Christian Campbell, I think, is also working his way into that conversation. He had an incredible season breaking out in the minor leagues this year, and now a lot of people think very highly of him. And their first round pick in 2021, who went the pick before we took college, of Marcelo Meyer, I think a lot of people think very highly of him as well. And he's also rated probably in that top 25-ish area. So the Red Sox, they are stacked with minor league hitting talent. Whereas we kind of have these two guys up there in the upper echelon. We have Basayo and Mayo, and they're kind of up there with like the Roman Anthony, Christian Campbell evaluation, which the Red Sox didn't have to give up. But then you go a little further down, and I don't know if we quite have that same depth to make a package that stands out like the Red Sox did. I think ultimately a package for Crochet might have had to been built around Heston Kjerstad, and then I think we would have either had to include Enrique Bradfield or Vance Honeycutt as kind of that second piece with upside, and then we kind of work from there. And ultimately, if that's something the White Sox would have been okay with, I think I would have pulled the trigger just because Crochet is that real top tier ace type of pitcher. But I think I might have balked if they insisted on Mayo or Basayo or like an established major leaguer already. Like if they wanted Westberg or Cowser, I think you have to say no to that.
And I think exactly what you're saying broke it down really well, right? The Orioles just don't have they still have the high end prospects, but they don't have the depth. They don't have, a dozen guys in the top 100 like they did a couple years ago. And so the Red Sox were just able to fill out the deal with more depth. And I do think that it would have taken Mayo or Basayo to get Crochet to Baltimore. And he
Right. To
talked
really
about this.
differentiate our package from
Right.
theirs.
To make it worth it. Like you can't just tie the deal. You have to beat the deal. And so we would have had to give up a better top line prospect, partially because we don't have quite the mid-range of prospects that the Red Sox have. And of course, this is something you mentioned during the trade deadline episodes last year, which is, when teams are getting prospects back, yeah, you could argue giving them back, Basayo and one player, Honeycutt or Bradfield, might give them a better, have more talent in the package than the Red Sox package. But these are all lottery picks to these are all lottery tickets to these teams. Prospects tend to be lottery tickets, and they wouldn't look at Basayo and say, okay, well, we're definitely getting what we expect Basayo to be. Otherwise, Basayo would be worth a whole hell of a lot more. I mean, that's just how prospect evaluation works, right? So I think it just would have been hard to beat that deal if the Orioles were able to do it without using Mayo or Basayo. I agree, but I just don't think there's a framework to make that deal happen. Um, I think the last thing I was thinking about, Daniel, is what's really left for the Orioles in free agency here. We talked last week about starting pitching, rookie Sasaki, which that domino hasn't dropped. Still, obviously, want the Orioles to make a strong push there, but that would feel like kind of a bonus to whatever else they're able to accomplish, considering it wouldn't really cost them that much money. Corbin Burns is still out there. It seems like there's some momentum building towards at least renewed negotiations with the Orioles. Does not seem like after signing O'Neill, they're going to be in on any big bats. Bregman, Christian Walker, I don't think they'll be in on those. I think it really comes down to pitching. We talked about Manaea and Pivetta, especially on the last podcast. They're both still available. And of course, relievers. We also talked about Tanner Scott. And then there are a number of just much older guys, David Robertson, Kenley Jansen, that after the experience with Kimbrel this year, I just am not sure I'd really be interested in another, guy who's pushing, who's above 35 and, clearly has their best years far behind them. Having them come in and giving them a big role in the bullpen, I think you're just setting yourself up for another situation as Kimbrel. So I know your guys, Pivetta. Are there any other remaining names that jump out at you, or is it just a matter of going and signing one or two pitchers?
Yeah, I think, as somebody who very closely involves themselves with Orioles talk and that sort of thing, I think a lot of people are starting to feel frustrated that we haven't addressed what is our most glaring need with Corbin Burns leaving, being starting pitching. And so we have new ownership, and they said they wanted to spend. And look, this kind of feels like that opportunity where you would say, yeah, this is a guy that we need back. And I don't know exactly how much he wants to come back. I know his personal catcher, James McCann, is no longer going to be here. At least his personal catcher with the Orioles. I don't know how close they are, personally. But man, I mean, it really does just feel like this is the kind of guy that you go all in on. He is seems to be declining a little bit from what he was in 2021, 2022 when he was a top flight Cy Young type of guy, but he really does, I think, have the makeup and just the build almost to make it work even when his stuff isn't the best anymore. So I think that you would be paying him a lot of money ultimately knowing that by year 6, 7, 8, that's going to be dead money. But I mean, we came in with this ownership group who, had some massive net worths, and we are paying whoever we get for this window that we have Adley, Gunnar, Westberg, because the way the market's trending right now, why would any of those guys humor extension talks unless we're blowing them away? So I think, look, to get a guy like Burns, you are paying him a lot of money for these first 3 to 4 years where I think he really would make an impact. And I've been trying to, tell people I talked about the Orioles, let's not get frustrated yet. It's only mid-December. The offseason's not over. We're not going into spring training with this rotation yet. But I think if we do go into spring training with this rotation, Nikhil, like this offseason was a failure. Like, what are we doing competing for the World Series when we don't add any pitching? And I know that Mike Elias is looking at the roster the same way as we are. I am sure he wants to add pitching. I trust his valuation. He's found great diamonds in the rough before. And I think that ultimately we will bring a pitcher in, which is why I'm trying to kind of talk Orioles fans down right now from being so mad in mid-December. But I've told them, I've been like, hey, if we go into spring training and nothing's happened, I'm going to be right there with you because we have all this young talent and this rotation would not play in the playoffs as currently constructed. So I mean, I think of the free agents most available, I've told you on our last pod that I do think Nick Pivetta is the one who kind of has the most upside. I know that his surface results don't necessarily indicate he's an ace. So if we do end up only signing Pivetta or only signing Mania, I wouldn't be like ecstatic, but it would be something. But I think that we need to do something. I wish that something was Burns. I don't think it will be. I have optimism we do something, but if we don't, there's reason to be upset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I just looked it up. The Burns trade happened in either late January or early February last year. So dominoes can still fall before them. But the problem is obviously if, the Orioles keep missing out on free agents, the pressure builds on them to get a starting pitcher, and other teams know it, and then the deals get more expensive. None of this is news to Michael Elias, but it's worth mentioning that this, at a certain point, you got to start spending like a winner. We talked about this in our last episode. You have to be willing to spend above your valuations to meet the market. That is a huge, huge factor in actually being able to secure free agents. It is also a recurring factor because if you are cheap year in and year out, you ruin your relationship with agents. Players take note. They feel like the Orioles aren't going to pay up for talent. It just makes it harder year in, year out. And the Orioles have dealt with this for the last decade or so. They need to kind of break that pattern and show the league, like, hey, new ownership, new money, we're willing to spend where it counts. And there's nothing wrong with, getting like, this is what I was saying earlier with O'Neill, right? You go with a more value play on O'Neill than re-signing Santander, who, is probably a better, more established player. Is he, O'Neill could end up being a better bat for the Orioles this year. Who knows? But certainly a clubhouse presence and a fan favorite, which, those things do matter to the team. They matter to the fans. But going with the cheaper option with O'Neill is fine as long as that money is going somewhere else. And if you were just finding deals for the sake of finding deals, to me, then, you're not taking advantage of the window, like you said. So I think you know, there really isn't any reason the Orioles can't bring back Burns. Again, I would understand if they didn't want to bring back Burns for, their regression concerns, but then that means you have to kind of go out and get at least one starter and one solid reliever, and find something within your valuation, but you have to go and be willing to do it. Um, Other than that, I just, if you walk out of free agency with O'Neill and Sanchez and maybe a, buy low starter, a rebound candidate, or a relief, or just one reliever, I agree. I think they've failed to make this team better, and that's what the goal is every offseason, right? Last all season, you brought in Corbin Burns. That's the bar. You've shown you are willing and able to do that kind of thing. If you don't do that again this year with the ownership, then there are some serious questions about what is the philosophy, what is the strategy, and more importantly, what is the vision for this window. So a little let's a little negativity to finish out that podcast there.
Well,
Just I
I think
agree.
the negativity is justified because
Oh,
real
I
quick,
agree. I
I'd like
agree.
to say because like I know that so it was the Angelos ownership for years up until this point. But dude, I mean, for the past like 5 years, we have been like a bottom five team in the MLB in payroll. And I'd like to I kept saying to myself, oh, we're banking all this money so that when we're good, we spend. But now that the Angelos is sold, we don't really get to reap the benefits at all of that banking all that money for the Angeloses. So now it's kind of we're starting over. And this new ownership, like we already were bottom five in payroll again this year. We've now had back-to-back 90-win seasons being a bottom five team in payroll. It's not that,
Look at the
we're
Royals.
trying to spend and it's not working out. We are literally just not spending money. Like at some point, we have to if we're serious about this thing. I know that Mike Elias is great at evaluating players, and I'm trying so hard not to get frustrated in December because there is time. There is still time, Orioles fans. But man, if March comes around and we are bottom five in payroll again, it's frustrating. It would be frustrating to see that because it does feel like we are wasting Gunnar Henderson.
Yeah, yeah, it tells you a lot about the ownership, a lot about the front office. It really makes you question a lot of the things that they say publicly about their commitment to the team and getting better and all that. And yeah, it's December and it's almost like we're ready to be frustrated and we're just looking for something that's like we can point to and say, see, we can do it. We can actually do this. So now, completely agreed. The making all those wins with low payroll this is not a reason to maintain a low payroll. It's a reason to invest more money in order to get yourself over the top. And look at what the Royals did last year. I do want to end with a positive note, though. I just saw this pop across my Twitter. Chris Davis and his wife recently donated $3 million to put together a pediatric cardiac lab at the University of Maryland Medical Center in Baltimore. Much has been made of Chris Davis. The giant contract, the fall off. Personally, get your bag, King. Sorry that the league wouldn't let you take the Adderall that you needed to hit the baseball. But look, at least Baltimore's getting some of that money back. It really does say a lot about Chris Davis that, he doesn't live here anymore and he still comes back to the city and donates money that, he probably is like, the team gave me all this money and I wasn't able to deliver on it. And I'm glad I can give some of it back to the community that, by and large, supported him for most of his career. I know, a lot has been made of, the fall off and the departure, but I have a lot of fond memories of Chris Davis, and it's nice to see that a player like that who, really didn't have a great, end of his time in Baltimore is still, committed to the city. So
Yeah, I think all Orioles fans do love Chris Davis. I think the frustration with Chris Davis was that he was the only person we invested big money in. So there was such, grand expectations on him to kind of be this messiah for a team that was looking to keep the momentum from 2014 and 2016 going when, ultimately the rest of the team was kind of trending downhill. And like you said, obviously when they took away his Adderall, he was a completely different player. But all Orioles fans do love Chris Davis. He did seem like a good person, and he was a really good baseball player in his prime. So look, I got love for Chris Davis. Now that it's all said and done, and I don't have to watch him go 0 for 50 anymore, I'm more easily able to remember the good times in 2013 and 2015.
exactly, a lot of big home runs. He never looked like he was swinging that hard. So with that, Daniel, thanks so much for joining me. I thought this was a really, really enjoyable episode, just reacting to everything that's gone down and, kind of getting ready to be excited, even though we're still holding in the frustration right now. Any last thoughts before we shut down here?
Yeah, just we got our handles here on X, right? So give us a follow if you haven't already at Nick Knows Ball for Nikhil at DROT_6 for me. This will be up on Spotify, on YouTube. Please check us out. We're going to be trying to clip this a little bit more so we can spread out the word on social media. So if you're watching, much love. We appreciate it. Go O's Han. Hopefully we make some big moves.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks to everyone who joined us. We'll see you next time.
One.